What are your earliest memories of childhood? Can you have a very early memory? Do you have any?
I think probably the first is not terribly interesting, but it was simply the fact that life was very Spartan during the war. I was born in the middle of the Second World War, but also for a decade or more after that, with food rationing right throughout the United Kingdom. And we had no car. But I do remember we had borrowed or were driven once out into the country from London, and a strawberry field where we could actually collect strawberries from a farm. That's probably about the first recollection.
Can you imagine how old you were at that time?
I suppose 4 or 5, something like that. But I mean, at 5 I was actually bicycling down what now would be called a main road with trams to my kindergarten on my own. And there was no sense that this was particularly dangerous at the time. So I was at a kindergarten down the road in South London from 5 to 8.
And at what age did you enter St. Paul's?
8.
At 8?
8 and a half, yeah.
8.
So I was ripped out of family life and institutionalized in a boarding school at the age of 8, which, having seen my grandchildren at that age, I do find pretty incredible. But this was a family tradition.
Yeah.
Meaning my father had been a chorister at St. Paul's Cathedral, London. His 4 younger brothers had all been there. My elder brother was there at the time, 3 years older than me. So it wasn't a particular choice. It was what people with my family background did. And it's obviously pretty demanding for an 8-year-old to be very intensively socialized with extremely tight discipline, because even from that age we attended services, and we had a year as probationers when we were not part of the choir itself, but were merely observers to get us conditioned into behaving appropriately. But I mean, from then on, we sang, from 9 to 14, we sang in the cathedral literally 13 times a week, paraded in, and obviously we're performing publicly.
The 13 times a week doesn't really give a sense of weight to the equaling 500 performances or
per year. Yeah. No, I mean, it was, and this was evidently not thought through particularly well, because masses of the things on the 5 weekdays, as opposed to Saturday and Sunday, had very few people in the congregation, but it was just normal practice and had presumably been like that for 100 years or more, and nobody really thought of changing anything.
What do you think, with that family tradition of being choristers in the choir, and the discipline, and the discipline of music, time and rhythm and melody and such. How do you think that has influenced the character of who you are, and or who others might be, with all that music tradition?
Well, obviously it inculcates a very deep appreciation of both language and music. And a lot of it was very routine, doing all of the psalms once a month, and pretty rigid services in those days. At the same time, there was a lot of exciting music as well, and Haydn was on the menu, and then of course we had this experience of singing at the coronation in Westminster Abbey, where our choir was linked with the Abbey choir, because they needed a bigger choir for the event. And if you didn't attend every one of the 6 rehearsals, you weren't allowed to go to the actual coronation. So obviously the sense of presence, of event, was very important. And I remember in 1951, when Eisenhower came to London and presented a vast book with the names of every American who'd been based in the UK during the war, which would then be placed in an American memorial chapel in St. Paul's Cathedral, in the Cathedral Church of the British Empire, which of course the Americans had chosen to leave a couple of 100 years earlier. But I can still remember this event, of course, with the King and Queen at that stage, present, and all the other paraphernalia of ceremony and royalty. But one of the things that this is actually a very early memory. I can still remember that I knew the names of about half a dozen of the vergers, the people who carried the rods in front of the choir, and the dean and the canons and everything in all the processioning in and out of the cathedral services. One of them, his name was Dean. And then President Isa got going with saying, "Mr. Dean, it's my honor as the President of the United States." And I thought, why on earth is he referring to the Virgin? But of course, this was just the formal way of talking to the very Reverend W.R. Matthews, who was the Dean of the Cathedral, of course. So my 9-year-old brain was having a curious kind of paradoxical use of formal forms of address.
Yeah.
And pinpointing which person he was actually talking to. So I mean that's an early memory about the complexity of language, at least.
And also who's who.
Yeah, of course. Oh yes, yeah. Now obviously the school itself was extremely hierarchical.
Yes.
So was the cathedral, with a dean and the canons and the minor canons and the organist and the junior. But I mean every term. We were graded, we were ranked in terms of performance in all of the school subjects. And in that school, from age 8 to 14, and in the next school that I was at from 14 to 19, all lists were in order of academic merit. So we were literally graded, and we sat in that order at both schools at meal times. So this sort of internalization of a pecking order of success in academic things was integral to the British way of learning to find your place in society, and in my case being very keen. I knew very little academic stuff before I arrived at the school aged 8, and I was humiliated by not doing very well in the first set of exams and determined to change all that, and became very good at reproducing school knowledge all the way through my schooling.
So it strikes me that ritual, protocol, discipline, set in ceremony, I mean, was something that was almost the rhythm of the life that you were
absolutely in. Yes. And with the bell ringing at certain times, you had to be have made your bed by a particular time and it be inspected. You had to stand in rows for showing that everyone was there constantly, and yes, the life was extremely well organized, and all the ceremony was also just as true of the next school that I went to in Kent, which was also an old family school. I went there as part of a family tradition, but also my Cambridge College as well, lots of ceremony, meaning students were obliged to have dinner every evening in college with all your fellow students. The whole idea meaning that you actually have a community of learning and of eating together, and ideally talking intellectually with your colleagues. And we were only allowed to sign out of dinner twice a week, so it was very definitely a commitment to people being members of a college, and in that sense not merely only studying, but developing a lifestyle.
Now I've got about 50 questions here. But one of it happens to do with all the order, discipline, ritual, ceremony, commitment. Do you think that's helped you discern when something might be out of pace, out of tune, not... Since you have this sense of structure, deep structure, do you think it has made you more aware of things when it's not in tune or in balance or in structure, and then to be critical of, is the structure the right thing? I'm not sure if I'm phrasing
It's an ongoing process, I think, and in that sense, the fact that everything was so incredibly disciplined meant that age 13, if you were good at schoolwork, if you were good at games, and if you had a good voice, you would become a monitor or prefect with responsibility for discipline for the junior ones. At the next school that I went to as well, exactly the same. If you were successful in the same areas, academic and sport and character, in whatever that meant within the institution's norms, you became a house prefect, and exceptionally you became a school prefect, and I ended up as so-called captain of the school, meaning head boy, for the last year. So in that sense I was maintaining these norms, and I wouldn't say that that was at all with any kind of critical awareness, very definitely not. But at the same sense, knowing that it was an effort to be there, and I didn't look particularly mature, although that didn't really upset me much. And I was successful on the sports field as well. Not nearly as talented as many others, definitely, but the sort of energy to keep going. But I think that the fact that I'd studied French and German very intensively at school, they were the two subjects that I specialized in to get a place at Cambridge, which was extremely competitive even then. And that I started studying French and German meant that between school, actually I left at Easter, so I had half a year before studying. And I spent 1 month in Vienna because we'd had an exchange with a Viennese boy. And then I worked for 3 months for a very wealthy German family in the middle of the industrial area, the Ruhrgebiet in central Germany. Extraordinary family, 5 children. Her doctor worked from home, had his own secretary, they had a cook, they had a house manager in a vast house, and they had the wish that I should be there to help the kids who had English in school improve their English, although I never spoke a word of English outside those little sessions with some of the kids. So I had the experience of living in a totally different kind of family life, and also a very different society. Germany at that stage, this was 1961, in the height of commercial success, meaning the Wirtschaftswunder, the economy, had really taken off, and people like the family that I was living with had benefited hugely. They were extremely rich, very highly disciplined within the family as well. But this made one very definitely aware that other ways of organizing family life, other ways of eating, of sitting at meals, of spending time, not so much within school but outside it, certainly made one open to cross-cultural awareness. And I certainly thrived on learning the language well at that point. And I also had spent several summer holiday 2 or 3 weeks in France, and I then spent another month in France before going. So I mean, I was very much open to cultural differences, and the fact that the French and the Germans were very different from the British. So it started a whole process of becoming sensitive to difference, very definitely.
Were these trips abroad and study and residence sessions something that your school organized?
No, that was my parents.
Your parents, okay.
Yes, very definitely. And
so they were
not
very
only
encouraging.
my mother was very much into that. She was herself very keen on languages, and she was also a drama person, had formal qualifications in drama, although she didn't get them until after she'd had 3 children. Of course, the war didn't help either. So she did this while I was off at boarding school, actually, and then had a career in drama, both performing but also adjudicating and teaching in schools some of the time, but doing a lot of guest lecturing as well on Shakespeare.
So, but your early foreign trip would have been the trip to the United States.
Oh, that
Canada.
too. Yeah, that too. Yeah, sure. I probably had 1 holiday in France before that, but it's true, yes. In 1953, when I was 11, the choir of St. Paul's were invited by a bunch of eminent Americans, including the English-speaking union as a formal structure, and because there were very strong links both sides of the Atlantic to try to bring understanding of Britain and the US closer together after the war. that we were invited to the States, and we sang in 41 cities in the course of 2 months. Went there, of course, by boat in the Queen Elizabeth, 4 days in this luxury liner.
Yeah.
But it was obviously a fantastic experience, and merely the concert side of it was formal. We were on stage. I mean, we were considered suitable for a stage in all those cities, and for St. John the Divine in New York on Carnegie Hall, and we sang in the White House. We sang with President Eisenhower and his lady wife, and Vice President Nixon and his lady wife, whose hand I shook.
I understand you also sang in Constitution Hall.
Where is that?
That's in Washington,
That's
D.C.
in Washington, okay.
That's
That means much more to you than me.
well, the White House, of course, it does. But
That's the name of a concert hall, is
yes,
it?
yes.
Okay.
The place where Marian Anderson was not allowed to sing there by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
yeah. So obviously this meant that we traveled by bus
yes.
across half of the United States plus a week in Canada, and experienced a fantastic, eye-opening experience of that side of America. Hotels, travel, enthusiastic audiences, and as you've seen from the press write-ups, it was a huge success.
It had reported as a huge success both in the U.S. and in the British papers.
Absolutely, yeah, sure. And for us as little boys experiencing Coca-Cola for the first time, and wonderful food in many of the hotels, very different from life back home, which was extremely Spartan.
Did you have much contact with Americans? Because you went from Canada with Canadian English to from New York, and then to Alabama and Tennessee. And
not an awful lot. There were 3 people from Columbia Associates who traveled with us and organized us.
Right.
And in my autograph book, I know that one of these guys, who was younger than the main manager, was probably in his mid-30s, something like that, who was very chatty all the way through, he signed his name and wrote Fulfillo the Politico, which is actually quite interesting in retrospect, because evidently he thought that I was at least being in some way analytical, even at that age.
So now, let's see, you were prepared with all of your studies to be you were on your way to an OBE.
Yes, if I had stayed in the system.
Yes, and then you said when you was it North Africa that you had your first kind of realization of what was being truly intended for you in terms of.
Well, in the sense that obviously Cambridge is a very elite place.
Yeah.
The assumption is that all students have a successful career ahead of them, and I certainly learned that many of my colleagues had much better education before getting there than in the school that I was at.
Yeah.
So it was a very stimulating, challenging intellectual environment. But I did the normal 3-year degree and had to look for a job, and I joined Government Cultural Service. I joined the British Council, which was active in 90 countries worldwide, basically concerned with promoting British values, and to do that, obviously you had to have some kind of interest in the countries where you were working. And I had a 3-month training session in Madrid at the British Institute, which was in fascist times then. And after a couple of weeks of lectures on how to handle a classroom, we were inflicted on helpless 12-year-old Spanish kids who were very patient because we were supposed to be learning how to teach English.
Yeah.
And this applied to even the people who were going to end up in administration. They were supposed to sense that. In fact, one of my aha experiences as a language teacher was that because in those days it was very much a mechanical mimicry, memorization type of approach, audiolingual, behaviorist approach to language learning. There were lots of artificial drills about, I have a head, do you have a head? I have 2 hands, how many hands do you have? This sort of inane dialogue, which was the mainstream there. And I asked these Spanish kids who are presumably in their second year of English learning, 4 hours a week or whatever, how many fingers do you have? And what do they say? 20, of course, because it's the same word for toes as fingers in Spanish. And my Spanish was okay, but not that good, and I hadn't thought that through, evidently. So this was a wonderful learning experience in terms of the need to understand the language of the learner.
Yes.
And that's where, in my later work, the focus on a monolingual approach in teaching English worldwide, which is absolutely central to both American and British promotion of English teaching worldwide, TESOL in North America, English language teaching in the UK. So in that sense, yes, that was helpful. And after my 3 months in Madrid, trying to learn the tricks of the trade, because I knew French, I was sent off immediately without more training to North Africa and found myself in Algeria in an office with about 5 of us sent from London, very much alongside the British Embassy. So, I mean, the first place I was taken the day after I arrived was to meet the British ambassador. So very much a sort of top-down world where you had to learn certain types of hierarchy in the same disciplined way as I had been brought up to, obviously, earlier. But you can't be in a post-colonial world, 8 years of hideous civil war, key thinkers about freeing colonies from oppression, Frantz Fanon, and so on. Lots of wonderful novelists who had written novels in French in the colonial period. The French were in Algeria for 130 years. So there were lots of novels of protest, of cultural pride in an oppressed group, meaning the Arab and Berber civilizations of Algeria. So, yes, I mean, this really shook up your smugness and made you realize that other cultures were very different, but equally valid.
Did you get to know the people within Algeria, or did you stay pretty much within the conclave?
I had a lot of contact with other British people who were very bright, very committed, had wonderful French. Some of them learned Arabic as well. I didn't. Also young diplomats from Pakistan and India and so on. There was that side of things. But I had very good Algerian friends, yes. I got to know quite a few. They were often French educated because they were middle-class people who had done university studies in either the humanities or in engineering in France and had gone back to build up the new country. So that I did know quite a few reasonably well and got invited to weddings a couple of times, which was an experience because it lasted 4 days and you were with men of your age all the time. So yes, I became very fond of several of them, in fact.
Was that unusual?
Yes, probably.
Yeah, you were sort of beyond the pale.
I think I was different in the sense that I did have much closer contact than more conventional British people, yes.
So you're veering off the path.
Yes, and that also applied when I had 3 years in Yugoslavia after that.
Yes.
Where I learned Serbo Croat, and none of the other British people in a large office in Belgrade and another one in Zagreb did that either, and therefore cut themselves off from insight into the culture and context in the way that I did.
I would imagine going to Croatia, Serbia, especially after the long history of disputes and conflicts and
yeah, sure.
That it must have been very, I don't know, not necessarily difficult, but it must have been, for me, traveling there just as a tourist, it was like eye-opening to really understand that you didn't casually remark about Serbians to Croatians.
Oh, no, absolutely. And they had their own separate education systems in each of the republics, and that was one of the strengths of Titoist Yugoslavia, that cultural and linguistic difference was acknowledged. You didn't try to eliminate it, which would have been self-defeating because it would never have worked. And that's one of the reasons why Kosovo is such a big problem, because there was an attempt to control the Kosovo Albanians by the Serbs, which is still an ongoing source of conflict. No, I mean, very definitely you were working in Slovenia or in Macedonia with Slovenians and Macedonians and knew that they were very culturally proud and distinct, yes. So I organized short courses in each of the republics with an American opposite number with the local authorities, so that they decided what they wanted, and we decided to bring in aid, meaning experts or language teaching specialists or whatever, who would then teach on these upgrading courses for language teachers.
Was it there that you, in Yugoslavia, that you had this sort of sense of what you've developed as a concept of language imperialism? Did you think of it before as language imperialism and then came to it suddenly, or how did that evolve?
No, not really, but I think I was open to the fact that colonialism had been in the interest of the colonizers rather than the others, and I did a 1-year MA between Algeria and Yugoslavia in Leeds, at Leeds University. It was an MA in linguistics and English language teaching at a time when applied linguistics and language pedagogy were not particularly well established academically. It was feeling its way. It was a very strong focus on phonetics and linguistics, and rather feeble when it came to language pedagogy. But at the same time, there were option courses, and I could have done sociolinguistics, but chose not to. Then I did African literature, because having worked in North Africa, I was very keen to read the wonderful novelists that there are from South Africa, from Kenya, from Nigeria, and Francophonic Africa. And all of that has to do with resistance to empire, basically. So, yeah, I mean, I had grounding in that kind of thing, but I think that the key formative factor in, well, there were several, of course, but among the main reasons for getting into a more serious study of linguistic imperialism was being married to Tove Skutnap-Kangas, a critical feminist researcher from a small language community, Finnish speakers, as compared with me with an English language background. And that I was teaching at a very progressive, multidisciplinary university, University of Roskilde, where you were supposed to relate knowledge to the context, to the culture in which knowledge was being produced, wherever, but formative otherwise, in a much more of a triggering factor. I'm sorry if I'm banging the table. Yes.
No. Forgive me.
Was well, I was.
And you do have.
Sure.
Your
yes,
coffee's
sure,
getting cold,
sure.
so feel free.
Was the fact that Tove, through Norwegian friends, was invited to assist a church body in Norway which was attempting to do something good for Namibians at a time when Namibia was occupied by South Africa, and there were refugee camps for Namibians in both Zambia and in Congo-Brazzaville, a former French colony. And that meant that we went to meetings several times in Norway to discuss what sort of educational materials should be sent to refugee camps for Namibians. And the Norwegians were modest enough to know that they didn't know enough about English teaching, and Tove knew a lot about bilingualism. And that meant that we therefore tried to find out what was being sent to these refugees. And basically, we discovered soon that not only from Norway, but also from Sweden and Denmark, they were sending early reading materials from the UK, from the United Kingdom, to Namibians, which were a series called Ladybird books, which are with a pretty picture on one page and a short text intended for mother tongue learning of English in bourgeois middle-class England. So you had these texts where you had Peter's helping Daddy wash the car while Mummy's being helped by Mary to do the washing up. So that this material was culturally, linguistically, and educationally totally inappropriate. and was being sent with the best of intentions. This is what was likely to help these poor refugees. And this meant that at that point, I started looking very seriously at what had happened in independent African countries after independence in education, to see what was being focused on, what there was in terms of an inheritance. And I was very interested in that already in Algeria, because of the attempt to revolutionize education, get away from a French content and language in education into something that was culturally appropriate, Arab and Berber. No, actually Arab, because the Berbers were being oppressed by the Arabs, linguistically and culturally. And the same one was presumably hoping would be the case in Ghana or Tanzania or all those other places which had become suddenly independent in the early 1960s. India, of course, a bit earlier. Well, 47, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And that meant that I started reading very widely at what had happened in post-colonial education and tried to explore why English was in fact still there in all those former colonies, and why in fact it had developed a stronger position in independent former colonies than in the colonial age. And that meant that it was an important area to try to look into and to see who had set the agenda, why things were happening as they were, why was there so much aid from Britain, and there were already, by the time I was reading up about this in the late 70s, early 80s, very good books denouncing aid as being an imperialist tool, basically, to maintain Western interests. And reading up what had been done by the locals, by the Americans, of course, who were there in a very big way as well, because the amount of funding from the US was vastly greater than from the UK.
This seems a very strange pattern, though, for you to be coming from this well-ordered, well-disciplined background, unless it seems that your family, maybe particularly your mother, was sort of widening the horizon.
My mother was always very open, in fact.
Yeah.
And certainly was disappointed that I left government service, British Council service, to start with no known career outside the system. But I was married to a Dane, and I was very lucky to get a full-time job in Denmark in 1973 when I arrived. You didn't need to have a doctorate to get into higher education in those days. So my qualifications were worked up over the next 15 years or so. And that meant that I was very fortunate to be in a progressive environment, which was in a way a product of the student revolution in 1968. Everything was being challenged. And the Scandinavian cultural norms, family norms, were very, very different. So I had to go through a massive transformation process, in any case, when becoming resident in Scandinavia.
I mean, when I think and look at all the clippings and and hear how you've progressed through a very, as you say, upper middle class kind of background, and then think of seeing you at Trondheimos and 7 acres and sheep and it's really
completely unpredictable. Yes.
Unpredictable.
Sure.
Do you think you would have ever seen? You're looking at yourself today and looking back at who you were then. Could the two of you ever imagined the progress?
I think the ecological side of it, living on the land for 30 years, is a different issue, and obviously it enlarges your awareness of nature, of seasons, of how stuff is produced and so on. All of that's extremely important in terms of one understanding of the world. At the same time, I think a major difference between many of the people in the academic world who are in English learning, in promotion of English worldwide, TESOL, English language teaching and so on, is that most of those people, they may have worked abroad for a few years, but they're fundamentally still anchored in a monolingual environment in the US or the UK or Australia or New Zealand, whereas I've remained outside it as part of continental Europe, seeing the role of English expanding right throughout continental Europe in ways that were unpredictable in the 1960s or even 1970s, and which nobody had really taken a measure of at that point. So I think one of the reasons why Linguistic Imperialism, as a book written in the mid-80s, not published till 92, is useful worldwide, I hope, I mean obviously it is that I had an insider's view of how things were done, but at the same time I was already an outsider in terms of analysing the uses to which English was being put in Africa, in India. Partly we had a very strong link with India through the 1980s. Wonderful, extremely competent researchers in language policy, sociolinguistics, language planning, and all those fields. And very strong links with Africans as well. I mean, a lot of my development has been because I've learned hugely from people from the post-colonial world, very definitely. And the combination there is of the fact that when I was trying to do field work in London to see how the insider's view of the promotion of English had evolved in the whole post-war period until the mid-1980s, I did interview a lot of people there. I mean, I named this in the beginning, in the preface to the book. But a close friend of mine from my early days in Madrid was then the director of British Council English Language Teaching Operations, and he gave me absolutely free access to all the confidential papers, and they really wanted. I mean, this is the way profound people, even if they work for a fundamentally imperialist cause, although they wouldn't see it that way, know that your knowledge is important, that you need to know how things have happened. And in fact, this guy that I'm talking about, also, when I produced a first draft for Oxford University Press, wrote an extremely insightful review of it, which said, okay, I disagree with the interpretation, but I think it's very important that the analysis there is published. So in that sense, there is this tension between an understanding of how things happen in the world and then whose interests you're actually otherwise trying to promote. And there are lots of well-intentioned people who are closeted in the States and the UK and so on, but they don't look at things in the same way as somebody who is on a daily basis living in a multilingual world, thinking of things from the outside, and trying to both internalize the values of people who are trying to create a different world. And it's very uphill even in the post-colonial world, because most post-colonial elites look after their own interests and have detached themselves from the needs of the mass of the population. And there are huge conflicts in countries like Tanzania, Kenya, South Africa, and so on, between elite interests and mass interests. And those are things that both Torv and I have worked pretty actively with for the last 20 years and more, in dialogue with people there. But then my task, I think, is definitely to try to analyze what's happening and influence things, but mainly to try to work on my own group, meaning try to persuade people in the British system, or Anglo-American system, if you like, to be more open to changing paradigms in understanding what's happening and changing what happens in teacher training, in MA programs, in doctoral studies, and so on.
So,
or decision makers as well.
My hero, Bucky Fuller, would talk about trim tab. And in fact, on his tombstone, it said, he'd put my name, put the dates, and then the phrase, just call me trim tab. And the concept was, if you want to turn the Queen Elizabeth left or right, it's very hard to do it from the bow because of all this mass. But the trim tab sits in the, is it the rudder? that you turn.
Okay, right
And
at the back.
it's the little piece.
Is that
in
what
the
it is?
slot. It's called the trim tab, and if you just turn that little slot, it then creates the pressure by which you then can turn a massive system.
Okay, yeah.
So if that is a concept, what would you think would be, from your work, the trim tab that would get a large system of dominance and monolinguistic, monoculture, corporate head about it? What do you think might be the effect of the work that you're doing as a trim tab to move people in a new direction?
I don't know that there's a single one, but obviously the fact that I worked a lot with Tove, my wife, and all of the work on linguistic human rights that we have done together, she much more than me, with very successful results for certain communities in terms of change. Clearly a decisive factor in my own thinking has been the way she conceptualized the term linguicism, meaning everyone knows what racism is, how it can be defined, what sexism is, how it can be approached, and how you can try to change things, classism as well. And nobody had thought in terms of hierarchies by means of language until Tove actually used this term linguicism by analogy with the other isms in order to see in what way hierarchies by means of language, which of course happens within a country with dialectal and socioelectoral differences and prestige norms and stigmatized norms and so on, but also in terms of education systems with certain languages being regarded as higher than others and others being banned or marginalized, particularly in tense situations or in that sense, obviously, America is a colonial power in terms of the indigenous languages. Sweden and Norway have been colonial powers in relation to the indigenous people, the Sami in the far north. So clearly it's a very powerful concept, linguicism, and linguistic imperialism in terms of the way I've looked at it and defined it and so on, is linguicism in action. So in that sense, developing anti-sexist, anti-racist strategies, obviously what I'm trying to do is develop anti-linguicist policies. In fact, it's a bit puzzling that neither Tove and I have actually used that term much.
Interesting.
And it has caught on in lots of places, but possibly not enough. And of course, a term like linguistic imperialism is something that can be defined in a variety of ways. And it's obviously a term that people can often be very defensive about if they're fairly conventional, because labeling anything as being imperialist is automatically these days somehow reprehensible. So I mean, there are obviously complexities there we still have to work through and try to battle with in order to use a rather militaristic sort of term. in order to turn the super tankers or the Queen Elizabeth boats. But I mean, the term itself has been very, very fruitful in influencing our thinking in terms of what we're trying to achieve by what we're doing, both in partnership and individually.
Well, and that's what I think both you and Tove have done, is invented new words or reframed words.
Coined them,
like linguicide.
Yeah, linguicide too. Yeah, sure.
And my hero Bucky would say, sometimes you don't have a word for what's happening. And so you need to invent a new word in order to really describe it. And do it accurately.
Yeah, sure. But Tove was the first person ever to write about linguistic human rights. Nobody had done that before. And she started drafting codes of linguistic human rights long ago. I mean, long before our books in the 1980s.
Well, years ago I took some folk dancing, and we learned the hambo. I don't know if you...
I don't know what that is.
It's a Swedish hambo with fiddle music. It's a folk dance. But it's very much dependent that there's equality in the movement of both partners.
Of course, yes.
So it can't be just a man leading.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
because
sure.
there's a balance thing
Yeah, sure.
that you do.
Yeah, sure.
And I must say, personally, I see the two of you in a doing a sort of a combo because I see the
Yeah,
influence
sure. Yes.
totally mutual and
Yeah, sure.
totally energetic. I can't remember which book it was of yours that I read, but I think it was I've heard the concept spoken that if you can get everyone, let me back it up a little bit, your language formulates your action. So if you have only one language as your way of being with the world, then that way influences the way in which you act.
Of course, yes.
And then I'm pretty sure it's from something that you've written. It's about, in terms with the concept of linguistic imperialism,
Yeah, sure.
is that if you only have one language worldwide, number one,
Yeah, sure.
the language, commercial language, will help you decide what you're going to buy.
Yeah, sure.
But
yeah.
also, you no longer need to have armies to enforce your will on people. You just use the language to create this kind of sphere of
You sound like
influence.
Winston Churchill, who articulated a plan for English as a world language in a speech in Harvard when he was given an honorary doctorate in 1943,
So
where
probably quoted
he
somewhere.
and Franklin Roosevelt
Yeah.
were attempting to formulate a world where military power would be redundant and where English would be the global language. And a lot of American and British policy has worked towards greater militarization worldwide rather than a military-free world. And a lot of the promotion of English has been very much an instrument of the foreign policy of those powers, yes.
So I'm sure it came from you. I may not have articulated quite right, but I did remember
Yeah, sure.
the sense.
No, but I mean, in practical
right?
terms
Yeah.
for language teachers,
Yeah.
the idea that you can go off and teach without understanding the culture and the language of the people whose educational problems you think you can solve
Yeah.
is a disqualification.
Yeah.
And yet this is absolutely fundamental to the English teaching promotion worldwide of the Anglo-American publishers, universities, language schools, and so on. Although, of course, there are many good teachers there who do, in fact, learn the languages of their learners and so on. But it doesn't alter the fact that the sort of institutionalization of that is unfortunate, and in a way, if you want to learn how to teach English, you'd do better to go to the Netherlands or Sweden rather than going to the UK or the United States, because there the assumption is that the match or mismatch between the language that a learner brings to the classroom and the target language is understood by all the language teachers, and they can build on that rather than wishing it away.
Right. So one of the questions I asked Tova yesterday was, as a young person and then as you are today, did you have sort of a vision of what you would like the world to be? And I think of a quote from Maxim Gorky. And you may have heard it from his work Mother.
Yeah.
And that it goes something like, there will come a time, I know, when people will listen to each other as if to music. And it goes on.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
But have you ever had sort of a concept of how you wish the world would be? Or what you're trying to work towards?
I'm afraid that I'm sufficiently influenced by my early socialization into believing that there will always be progress, and that therefore one is attempting to improve matters. But on the other hand, I think that that probably is true of many people who are well educated, wherever they come from. But that the nature in which societies have been organized counteracts that very largely and serves the interests of the few rather than the many. And I think that all of us who are trying to work with human rights are doing so because they think that a better world can be achieved, and that the les damnés de la terre, to use Frantz Fanon's term, the accursed of the earth, if you translate literally, will be able to do better because society can be organized more justly. I mean, it's obviously a vision in all the great religions that this should be the case. So that in that sense, even if I may have lost my faith in institutional church, like the Church of England, the ethical values that drive you are unchanged. And those are values that all religions would like to promote, although this is not how they function, whether it's Islam or Confucianism or Christianity. And I'm afraid a lot of the work being done by Christian missions nowadays still, I mean, until fairly recently, I was convinced that this was the colonial way of combining missionary activity with educational activity. There's a vast amount of missionary activity still nowadays which is serving to promote corporate interests indirectly, even though people may have the best of intentions. And in that sense, yes, if things are confrontational, and that's why to some extent many people who are liberal would condemn everything that I write because they think that it's extremist in some sense and do not see problems in the same way. So yes, I suppose I'm driven by some kind of a vision of a more just world where everyone's possibilities would be realized, and how far it's been articulated in writing, probably not much actually.
So how many books and articles do you have the big bib like Tova?
Tova has a huge resource system, which is everyone's writings.
Oh, yeah.
And then, of course, she has the fact that her own books have been translated into 40 languages, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, my books have been published in, I think, 12 countries.
Yeah.
And probably 7 or 8 languages, something like that, yes. So, in fact, one of my objections to people who denounce what I stand for is the fact that they have probably read part of a book published in 1992 and not much since.
Right.
And I do think that's a bit unfair because people like myself and many, many others have written a vast amount ever since.
Yes.
And it's quite hard work. Obviously, it is academic stuff, although my book on European Union policy, which was published in 2003, English Only Europe, ? Challenging Language Policy, was very definitely an attempt to influence decision makers, because at that stage English was expanding at the expense of French in terms of the hierarchy of languages in the systems of the European Union, meaning the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of Ministers. But I was also hoping that this would be a book that the general public might read, or that interpreters, translators, bureaucrats in the system, or even politicians. But I'm afraid that a book that is, whatever it is, 250 pages, doesn't get through to people like that. So it was possibly naive to even think in such terms.
You don't have the single-page executive summary?
Yes, I do, and it was on my website for years. But getting through to decision makers is very hard work. And I mean, I know this from this part of the world. In the Baltic states, former communist states, meaning Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, language policy is taken very seriously and politicians are deeply involved in it. In Sweden and Norway, to a greater extent than in Denmark, Finland has very good institutions working on language policy, both for the local languages and for the need for international languages. Denmark is the worst of all of the Nordic countries in that sense, where the politicians have been naively thinking that English is the only foreign language you need worldwide, and neglecting the languages that have had a very strong position in Denmark for the last 40, 50 years, meaning French, German, Russian, to a lesser extent Spanish and other Slavic languages, Italian. But I mean, many of those languages had very good teaching setups and research setups within Denmark.
Right.
And the way education has been squeezed financially, universities as well, means that most of those environments have shrunk to the point where they're very fragile. Even German, which is very puzzling because there are very few really big companies in Denmark, mostly medium and small sized corporations or companies. And the biggest export markets are Germany and Sweden. And in Germany, you can't use English with small and medium-sized companies. German is incredibly important for the Danish economy, but even that the politicians haven't taken on board. The Danish industrial organizations have been pleading for more focus on that for a long time without much success. And this means that language policy has not been understood by politicians. And many people, including myself in Denmark, have gone with single-page suggestions for what needs doing. We've had very good conferences on language policy with educationalists and experts from the trade unions representing language teachers and the business world and industrial world. But no journalists, no politicians would come to an all-day meeting on this.
Yes.
But then when we summarize it, a Danish colleague and myself, for instance, a recent conference 5 years ago, with 25 recommendations, send it to all the politicians, nothing happens.
Yes.
It's not high enough on their list of priorities. So that getting through a message in favor of diversity, in favor of equipping a larger section of the population with key languages. I mean, languages like Portuguese are very important now in Brazil and in several African countries, as well as the local languages. And that means that all of us who are working for education to respect diversity within the education system are having trouble in our own home patch in persuading the government to continue. My own institution, Copenhagen Business School, has eliminated Russian and Italian a few years ago and is now eliminating German, Spanish and French, or not totally, but downgrading it, so it's simply an extra resource. And if you want to understand those markets, if you understand the history, say, of Denmark vis-à-vis German, because German was the language of the Danish court and Danish industry, as it was, 200 years ago. And there have been wars in the 19th century, the border changing all the time, until 1919. And there's still a German-speaking minority in Denmark and a Danish-speaking minority on the other side of the border. And even so, English has been regarded as God's gift to humanity by naive politicians of right and left for the last 40 years. So it's incredibly difficult to get one's academic knowledge into policy making. The European Union has done a bit to try to promote that, but without a great deal of success anywhere, actually. They are now funding good research as well on multilingualism, and I've been instrumental in assessing applications and projects for the European Union for the last 6 years. So, I mean, there are lots of good things happening, but it is very uphill.
The idea of getting it clear message, unfiltered through all the static and everything else that's happening.
Sure. And also, I mean, we've had a neoliberal government for the last 13 years in Denmark, initially right-wing, now social democrat-led, which has never questioned American policy. Gone to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, produced then a Secretary-General of NATO who's a Dane, former Prime Minister, who was there because he'd always do what the Pentagon wants. And most Danes are a bit suspicious, but there's no channel for change within the political system in Denmark at the moment, although there are very good leftist parties which tried to influence things within the government and were helpless and have therefore collapsed, and a more leftist party outside it, which still has a good analysis of why inequality is being created worldwide through neoliberalism and the military activities of the United States. I mean, America now has forces in 48 out of 53 African countries in order to tap African resources.
I didn't realize that.
No, I mean,
military forces.
People don't know these things. And
Yeah.
I mean, one has known that there have been bases in 180 countries and so on.
Yes.
But I mean, Africa is a key place now for resources, and the economy is going to boom because there is money now
Yes.
in the system there, although most of it's been put into offshore banks
Right.
for the sake of the elites until now.
Yes.
But this is the way American empire power or corporate power, and of course it's not only American, it's also Chinese and Japanese and German and so on, are going along with an agenda which is making life more difficult for the vast majority of the world's population.
I know Obama just had a big conference of African nations
Absolutely.
on the commercial development.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and the American army is there to make sure it happens. No, I mean
English, and English.
I mean, I'm
too.
quoting the Guardian.
And I'm not
Yes.
saying, I'm not saying
No, you're
UK,
quite
I'm
right.
saying English, the language English.
Oh yeah,
of
but
course.
there's both the English language, but also the armies of France and Britain, the old colonial powers.
Yes.
Hand in glove with Obama.
Yes.
The French socialist president is Obama's best friend in Africa at the moment.
Yes.
And worldwide, and I mean obviously the French left is dismayed by the way this is happening. But the French socialists, including Mitterrand,
Yes.
have always been imperialist in Africa, and the French have had forces in Africa ever since decolonization in 12 countries.
My goodness. Well, let's see. I'm going to give you a break.
I think Bucky would have a heart attack too.
Bucky is turning, and he's
Yes.
not being such a trim
Yeah,
tab
sure.
these
Yeah,
days. Because-
meaning his trim tab has not influenced enough in America.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea of making the world work for everyone.
Yes.
We're not quite there yet.
No, I'm afraid not. But we're all trying.
We're all
There are
trying.
lots of people trying. Yes.
And maybe sort of as a wrap up, what gives you the get up and go to get up at 5 a.m. to break ice
And
on
go
the
swimming,
lake?
go swimming, yeah,
Swimming.
sure. Oh, the fact that we have such wonderful friends worldwide who are asking us to do things all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not on our own. There are masses of people who are constantly asking me to do things. And in that sense, it is an ongoing shared struggle with people worldwide,
Yes.
including the United States, of course.
Yes. Yes.
There are wonderful universities, there are wonderful people
Yeah.
who we learn from all the time. So it's not an either-or situation. There is a possibility of change everywhere.
You make me think of the French Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin,
Of course, yes,
who
sure.
he talked about this noosphere of
Yes.
energy and
Yes,
light
yes,
around
sure,
the globe.
yes,
So
yes, yeah, sure.
we're all plugged in. And of course,
sure.
exactly what you've said is why I'm sitting here.
Yeah, sure.
This is
Yeah,
the,
sure.
the
Yes.
hope of everything.
This is why you Skype with every week and exchange experience. Yes.
Shall I turn it off?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Oh, it was brilliant.